Hello, my name is Declan Kent, and I'm going to be doing a quick presentation that covers my investigation into how psychological practitioners and therapeutic practitioners differ, as well as areas they may share similarities with. So I'm going to introduce this topic to you with the same statistic that motivated me to become a psychotherapist in the first place. Over 1.69 million people in the UK were referred to talking therapies in 2019. And that got me thinking about what encompasses that talking therapy moniker, and ultimately, the myriad of professionals that encompass it. I wanted to be able to concretely say that I am a psychotherapist because, and I couldn't find the attribute of that role that made me feel like I did the title justice with a simple description. And at the time, I was an assistant psychologist in a rehabilitation hospital, and that made me feel like I was more akin to a clinical psychologist as opposed to a traditional psychotherapist. And this isn't an uncommon thought, as many people believe that the physical occupancy of the healthcare professional governs what role they encompass. Take, for instance, dentistry. As a healthcare profession that has a trained individual educated in small scale operations, medicine, and knowledge of oral hygiene. That's obviously an oversimplified definition, but how many people can say that they have such a concrete and simplified description for my job role? Even more confusing was when I went into higher education and found myself feeling frustrated that the lectures that I was being taught for psychotherapy ultimately covered topics that I had already learned in my role as an assistant psychologist. They were very much simplified core concepts of psychotherapy that were highlighted under specific circumstances and specific approaches that were then brought into an approach that I could use skills in order to benefit someone else. So, when I was given the opportunity to conduct my own research study, I instantly took the chance to investigate this confusion and to see if it was unique to me or if others in my academic area also shared very similar confusions. This ultimately came to be true, as multiple conversations with multiple healthcare professionals also were just as confused with these roles, as well as what they do outside of the quote unquote just talking to people. These conversations formed the basis for the questions I wanted to answer, as well as this confusion that appeared to devalue the importance of my role as well as the roles I was talking to. Since this investigation is based on simple conversations, I feel it pertinent to investigate the four professions that I had the most contact with so I can carve myself a better image or a stronger image of what psychotherapy is, as well as maybe others that I've spoken to. But rather than simplify these roles into one group, I wanted to inform readers to the importance that these roles have within their respective sectors. Therefore, I will refer to counsellors and psychotherapists as therapeutic practitioners, whilst referring to counselling and clinical psychologists as psychological practitioners. So, to best understand how therapeutic and psychological practitioners are so unique, where better to find this information than from the nation's healthcare provider, the NHS. Here I compiled some defining characteristics from all the roles on the NHS Careers website, which really highlight how similar these roles actually are. For starters, they are all referred to as a psychological profession, and as such are bound to the NHS pay bands of Band 6 and Band 7. The only exception to this was counselling, whose band was not represented. Yet another confounding fact the NHS promote is how these roles must abide to a professional standards authority, with counsellors being part of the BACP or of other similar quality, psychotherapists to the UKCP, clinical psychologists to the UKACP, and counselling psychologists to the HCPC. Finally, the bulk of these definitions is the symptomologies they treat, which highlights again areas in which they are similar, with the only notable difference being the inclusion of learning difficulties for psychological practitioners. The greater importance for a governing body is one that many find to be a necessity within a practice in healthcare, as it solidifies key qualities the practitioner must have. Yet, outside of the NHS, it is jarring that counsellors or psychotherapists do not necessarily have to be a part of these bodies, rather, they are more of a desirable trait. In reality, therapeutic practitioners mostly report being in these bodies to boost the clientele that they can have, as they appear on a registry that the public can access and then, as a result, can contact them for sessions. Nevertheless, I wasn't going to get any answers from looking up general information. I had to go a bit more in depth. With a generalized objective in mind, I went about investigating this with a mixed methods design. This encompassed both quantitative questions as well as qualitative interviews. The questionnaires acted as a primary recruitment method for the interviews, whilst collecting valuable data along the way. Said data aimed to capture the demographics of the four roles mentioned prior, whilst also investigating other areas that they may be struggling with. One such area was self-care and self-worth. This was brought about due to my own insecurities, which were felt by my other counsellors and psychotherapists that I had spoken to. As such, I gained the approval of Cook Cotton to utilise their mindful self-care scale to assess the participants' methods of self-care whilst also taking advantage of the open source Warwick Edinburgh Wellbeing Scale to determine feelings of self-worth and value. The participants were recruited via a snowball sampling and opportunity sampling approach, which aimed to find the most available and suitable participants within the therapeutic and psychological practitioner titles. As such, many were contacted in a variety of ways, which ranged from simple conversation to posting on the BACP notice board. Once completed, participants were offered a follow-up study, is where the qualitative information was investigated. Said information was gathered via Zoom or Microsoft Teams to maintain safety during this global pandemic. The topic schedule was purposely left open-ended to capture participants' opinions and experiences, rather than narrowing their answers to suit the research question. The interviews would approximately last 20 or so minutes, and within that time, many interesting points were raised. It is unfortunate that participants from clinical psychology or psychotherapy did not volunteer, but interviews did take place to represent counselling psychology and counselling. What resulted was a vast amount of data, which alone could have facilitated its own quantitative study. I specifically chose these three graphs from the demographic portion of the questionnaire as I feel they illustrate something quite unique. On the left, you can see the types of approaches used within their respective practices. I want you to observe the clinical psychologist only opting for two approaches, whilst the rest choose to take a more eclectic or integrative approach. Furthermore, on the upper middle graph, we can see how the training pathways for these professions also range in terms of part-time and full-time. Now, whilst it's not specifically mind-blowing that the university courses would offer part-time courses, I found it interesting that there was quite a nice distribution of part-time and full-time students, which shows that the flexibility of the training pathway for these roles is still quite paramount. Finally, on the table underneath, we can see the pay bands reported from the participants, which shows a strange outlier in counselling. As represented by the purple bar, one counsellor reported earning up to £96,000 annually, whilst the doctorally educated psychological practitioners reported being paid in the same pay bracket to the therapeutic counterparts. What was more interesting was the levels of self-care, value, and worth being reported via the two additional questionnaires. As demonstrated on the left, there are areas where therapeutic practitioners excel at, whilst psychological practitioners struggle, and vice versa. The low points of the scale represent activities not done by participants, which, upon reading into it, shows that they lack exercise as well as seeking out relaxing smells or other images. Otherwise, the graph indicates a general trend of caring for oneself among all groups. The graph on the right is where things become a bit more complicated, as the scores for self-worth and value are lower on a general scale for therapeutic practitioners. The lowest scores come at question 14, where all participants report not feeling exceptionally cheerful. Interestingly, the counselling psychologist group report having very little interest in trying new things. As for the transcriptions, I decided to utilize thematic analysis to develop codes and themes to paint an overarching story within the interviews. Upon recording all the interviews, I would transcribe each word as exactly as I could, down to the individual mannerisms and inflections. When I had a collection of scripts, I began analyzing the notes I had made to see if I could find any trends among them, and these trends are represented in the Venn diagrams located on the slides. As shown, there are elements of individual differences for therapeutic and psychological practitioners, yet the similarities between them are just as revealing. Starting with the top diagram, there is clearly a common trend of using psychological theory to assist in therapy, along with a one-to-one dynamic and person-centered outlook. Furthermore, both report being expected to have lengthy placements to practice their approach, yet feeling particularly unskilled upon leaving their respective courses. Finally, the lack of public knowledge and awareness plays a strong factor into their perceived lack of value. What is even more demotivating is the common trend of clique cultures within the healthcare sector, which looks down upon psychological and therapeutic practitioners for a vast amount of reasons. Namely, the therapeutic practitioners reported feeling looked down upon due to their lack of protected titles, and unjust comparisons to other forms of counselling, such as camp counsellors or school counsellors. In contrast, the psychological practitioners reported being looked down upon due to their lack of wanting to practice a more person-centered way that is not as conducive as their organizations would like them to be. For instance, they would prefer to be more assessment or practice focused that shows more of a development alongside their patients. So ultimately, what did this study find? Well, it isolated a common trend of feeling disrespected or looked down upon by others of a more prestigious class. One participant stated that she feels she has to be careful with the word counselor as she doesn't want to accidentally offend her assistant psychologists who think of the phrase as a bit more of a lower standard. Yet, ironically, the same participant says that the best assistant psychologists she's ever hired were counselors first. Additionally, the findings represent how similar counseling psychology is akin to therapeutic practitioners. And looking into this further, it's clear to see why. The person-centered movement definitely shaped a more holistic role. In many ways, it's interesting that the more things progress with clinical and counseling psychology, the more they borrow from one another to the point where the roles are so similar that it begs to be argued if they are actually the same profession. Finally, the most interesting finding came because of the enigmatic psychotherapist role, in which all participants reported how the role is unique and so advanced that it is a unique form of counseling, which is ultimately not the case. So, where does that take these findings? Well, for starters, it's clear that more needs to be done to demonstrate psychotherapy more clearly to avoid these misconceptions from arising further. It's either that or the more prudent solution of making psychotherapy a protected job role that makes it separate to the more generally available counselling. The presence of a protected title would prove invaluable for these roles, yet especially for psychotherapy, if the misconceptions are to be believed and this is meant to be a more specialised form of counselling. Furthermore, I propose that since therapeutic practitioners and psychological practitioners are expected to work collaboratively, a multidisciplinary education style should be implemented. This would mean that students would coexist with other members of a more generalized psychological cohort, with specific nuances being addressed in private lectures. Above all else, however, is the need to decrease this overt specialization in these sectors, as the more people become known for their specializations within certain specific niches, the less generally available they become or are perceived. Please pause if you would like to take reference to the references that I have spoken about during this talk, and thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. If you have any questions about my study, then please feel free to place them in the comments and I will answer them within the hours of the research conference. If not, then feel free to email me directly on the email address on the screen. I highly encourage you to visit some of my other cohort members and see what they've been investigating. Thank you very much again. My name is Declan, and I hope you have a nice day.